Hello ATF team, Dr. J here with another ATF breakout, and we'll start talking about week 6 here of your FFPs. And what you notice is, again, you're not seeing a tremendous amount of change from week 5, but you should see, again, some marked change from weeks 3 and 4. We're still focusing on the core. We're not going to develop that strength overnight. Again, many years spent with a lot of core dysfunction or the inability to contract and stabilize those core muscles, and so we're going to continue our focus on that for one more week. What you will see on week 6, however, is an advance in our Indian club movements, and we're training that, again, that shoulder blade and that upper thorax, how to articulate with one another, as well as that focus on the glenohumeral joint, which is the fancy way of saying how the ball and socket joint of our shoulder, or that traditional upper arm and shoulder blade where they come together. Remember that the shoulder is actually a girdle and that it functions with one another. And really focus on Indian clubs this week, and I want you to focus on doing those patterns correctly. This is extremely important. Again, like anything else, if you don't fire in the right sequence, that you create a distortion or a dysfunction. And when we work so hard in the beginning at establishing that mobility, we continue to focus on establishing that mobility. We're really trying to help enhance what are called force couples. And what that is again, those muscles always work with one another on a kind of a pulley system. As one shortens, one lengthens, and we have to have that fire in the right sequence. I am by no means a mechanic, but you can think about this in terms of an engine, the way the pistons move in and out, the valves and the crankshaft, and when there's something off or there's a misfire or you have grinding of those pistons in there, it's going to break down that engine. So we can think of it much the same way. If we don't fire those muscles in the right sequences or with the right types of force couples, we end up with dysfunction rather, and we end up with too much grinding on any one area. And this breaks down the articular surfaces within the joint, and it also breaks down and serrades or kind of cuts the soft tissues through the pinching action. So that's why we worked on that mobility, and that's why we're working on the arthrokinematics, or we're working on this rhythmic stabilization of the shoulder. And you'll notice that even though many of us don't walk around, with Indian clubs, and you're saying, what in the world is this? If you really look down and break down the movements, you can think about any of your activities of daily living that you may do: reaching, grabbing, twisting, pulling, chopping wood, using a shovel. All these movements come in handy or are used or demonstrated within the Indian club movement. So that's why we do these. Again, we know many of you don't have Indian clubs or may not have access to the Indian clubs, even though a few of those were purchased and out there for you. And so you can do this again with a stiff wrist and an open palm, and you can work through the movements. And what I would ask you to do is go ahead and watch Tommy, Doc Hef, and Chad, and see what they're doing, and really focus on the movements of their elbows. Again, tracing the elbow, as well as where the extension comes in and where the flexion. So when the arm straightens out or when the arm bends, and what pattern the elbow is making through that movement. We're working these forward and backward, and so really focus on that pattern over the week. Again, on your core things and on your ball rolling. Anytime you can, if you can decrease your contact points to make things more difficult, we'll continue to work through those progressions. A couple of you sent in really good questions, one of which is, can we skip ahead? And my general recommendation is don't ever skip ahead maybe more than 1 week. Again, about every other week we have a change in the progression in an exercise. I hope by now you've started kind of picking up on some of that pattern. And when we skip a full progression, there's risk that we kind of miss a key element in between. And again, remember, it's baby steps. We're trying to teach that core and the body to develop correctly. And when we skip more than a week or so, we can jeopardize that. But on the flip side, some of us are really strong and have the ability to do that, but knowing that we're all on a little bit different level. But again, that's why we categorize you by dysfunction, because we had a way to personalize it to each one of you. The next question was, can you focus on one dysfunction? if you don't have enough time. I know time is just a real challenge for a lot of you. Again, we try to build those 15-minute segments, but some of you are finding that these are more challenging than others, or you have more dysfunctions than other folks. And so here's a couple recommendations. One, if you have 2 dysfunctions, you can split them. Do 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening. If you have 2 or more and it's just not possible for you right now to fit in, then can you do and focus on 1? Well, the answer to that is yes, you can focus on 1. So which one should that be? Our recommendation is going to be, generally speaking, you're going to start on either end of the chain. I generally recommend starting at the lower part of the chain, meaning where your foot is in contact with the ground. So whatever's closest to the ground, you start with, because we spend all day long transferring forces from the ground up our body, especially if you're more in an active part of your job or your everyday activity where you're on your feet a lot. You probably want to start there, and so that way if the issue with your low back or the issue with your knee actually has something to do with where your feet are, where they're rotated, like an L1, even an L2 for that matter, it's best to start there. But on the flip side, if you spend the greater part of your day seated and your challenges, like many of you, was more of that U1, and you're complaining, or your chief complaints are mostly of that neck pain, headache, shoulder pain, and things like that, it may be best that you start at the U1 and you can focus on that. Again, this is all about working at your own pace and working what works for you in your world, and so that's what we always want to do, is make this work for you. I myself did this when I worked on some of my dysfunctions when I started this just over a year and a half ago, of correcting some of my dysfunction using this system. And I started on the lower end because I had a lot of low back pain, and those were my issues, and I had some L2 and L1 patterning things. I had really tight gastrocnemius, real tight calf, and I started there and I worked my way up, and that worked well for me. Now I'm really working on the U1 things. Even though I don't necessarily have real bad forward head posture, I definitely can tell that I have that tightness in my lat and that tightness in the trap that really restricts some of my shoulder movement. So I'm focusing a lot on mobility on U1, and then the Indian Club activities myself. So I'm no different than you all. I'm working on these things too. And so yes, the answer to that question is you can focus on 1 dysfunction at a time. I would recommend starting from the floor up. So if you're L1, L2, or comboing that with a C1, you start at the one closest to the ground. On the flip side, if you spend a lot of days seated and your primary issues are with the forward head or the shoulders and neck, then you can start on the U1. Remember, this is all about you, and ATF is here to help you function better in your world. See you next week.